Hello everybody, and welcome back to our digital SAT reading and writing course. Today we'll be doing lesson 2 out of 15 on textual evidence. So let's waste no time and get straight into it. So first, what to expect. A textual evidence question will present you with a prompt. The prompt will be regarding any topic, and it will present a claim and possibly some supporting evidence. It may not, it may just be a claim, but that part's not important. The question will ask you to then choose a piece of evidence or a quotation that might support or weaken the author's claim. So it's very important that you understand what the author is trying to say and their point of view so that you can correctly answer the question. And of course, the questions will likely include pieces of evidence that were not stated in the prompt. So some of this outside information you're going to have to include in context of the prompt to try to determine if it would support or weaken the prompt, depending on what the question is. So the method that you can employ here is to first read the passage carefully, understand the structure and the perspective, determine the points being made about the topic, and then of course analyze the questions and see which ones would correctly answer your question. So let's practice on some examples. This is once again a text from an actual SAT, so hopefully by reading this we can get some real-life practice on what you might see on another SAT test. Black beans are a nutritionally dense food, but they are difficult to digest in part because of their high levels of soluble fiber and compounds like raffinose. They also contain anti-nutrients like tannins and trypsin inhibitors, which interfere with the body's ability to extract nutrients from foods. In a research article, Maricela Granido and Glenda Alvarez from Simon Bolivar University in Venezuela claimed that inducing fermentation of black beans using lactic acid bacteria improves the digestibility of the beans and makes them more nutritious. So let's think about this, what we've just been presented with. So of course we're talking about black beans here, and we're talking about how they are difficult to digest and due to various reasons, right? And then of course we have our scientists here that are proposing that inducing fermentation using lactic acid bacteria can improve the digestibility of the beans. So now let's look at the question. It's asking us which finding from the research, if true, would most directly support their claim. Let's look at A. A says, when cooked, fermented beans contained significantly more trypsin inhibitors and tannins, but significantly less soluble fiber and raffinose than non-fermented beans. But there's something wrong about this question. This question is talking about when cooked, fermented beans contain significantly more whatever, right? But this is emphasizing being cooked, okay? So in the article here, it doesn't mention anything about cooking the beans, only about fermented beans. So there's no comparison being made between fermented beans and non-fermented beans. It's comparing cooked versus not cooked, which is why A is not correct, because that's not what they're arguing in the prompt. So let's look at B now. B says, fermented beans contain significantly less soluble fiber and raffinose than non-fermented beans, and when cooked, the fermented beans also displayed a significant reduction in trypsin inhibitors and tannins. Now, this question is a much better candidate because here it's talking about the fermented beans, and this part about when cooked, it's not as relevant because, of course, being cooked is not mentioned in the article. However, fermented beans is mentioned, and it does say that the fermented beans contained less soluble fiber and raffinose than non-fermented beans. So this is a very good option. Let's move on and check the rest of them. C says, when the fermented beans were analyzed, they were found to contain 2 microorganisms, lactobacillus, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, and another bacteria, that are theorized to increase the amount of nitrogen absorbed by the gut after eating beans. C adds extra information that is not really necessary to this question. It's talking about bacteria that might increase nitrogen absorbed by the gut, but it doesn't really help adding to the idea that it improves digestibility and makes it more nutritious. It's talking about nitrogen, but it doesn't really connect that to digestibility and nutrition. It just adds on the idea of nitrogen being absorbed, which, you know, the fact of it being more digestible is up for debate, but it's not trying to make a claim about digestibility, it's talking about something else. So we know C was not going to be the right answer here. Let's check D. Both fermented and non-fermented black beans contained significantly fewer trypsin inhibitors and tannins after being cooked at high pressure. So D here is similar to A in the sense that fermented and non-fermented beans here, they're saying are the same, but the The independent variable here is cooking, which once again is not mentioned here. So we know that B must be the correct answer. Let's move on to another example. Born in 1891 to a Quechua-speaking family in the Andes Mountains of Peru, Martin Chambi is today considered to be one of the most renowned figures of Latin American photography. In a paper for an art history class, a student claims that Chambi's photographs have considerable ethnographic value. In his work, Chambi was able to capture diverse elements of Peruvian society, representing his subjects with both dignity and authenticity. So, take note of some of the points made in this topic here. They're talking about our subject, who is a renowned figure of photography, Latin American photography to be specific, and he's able to capture diverse elements of Peruvian society, representing dignity and authenticity. So keep this in mind as we look at the question. The question is asking, which finding, if true, would most directly support the student's claim? Now remember, the student is claiming about the diverse elements and representing subject with dignity. Let's look at A. A says, Chambi took many commissioned portraits of wealthy Peruvians, but he also produced hundreds of images carefully documenting the peoples, sites, and customs of indigenous communities of the Andes. Now, this question seems like a very good option because it does talk about wealthy Peruvians, which is not as related to the Peruvian society, but it adds on the peoples, sites, and customs of indigenous communities of the Andes, which is the Peruvian society. So, it does capture ethnographic value in terms of the customs and, of course, the people as a whole. So this question is a very good option. Let's look at some of the other ones. B says, Chambi's photographs demonstrate a high level of technical skill as seen in his strategic use of illumination to create dramatic light and shadow contrasts. The main point that B is trying to argue is that he has a high level of technical skill. However, the prompt is arguing that Chambi was able to capture diverse elements and his work had a lot of ethnographic value, not skill. So we know that B is not going to be the correct answer either. C. During his lifetime, Chambi was known and celebrated both within and outside his native Peru, as his work was published in places like Argentina, Spain, and Mexico. C. The topic that C is trying to portray, or its claim, is saying that he was celebrated and his work was published in places like Argentina, Spain, and Mexico. But this is talking about Peruvian society and the ethnographic value. And the answer choice C is talking about how he was celebrated and places his work was published. It doesn't directly address the ethnographic value and the diverse elements of Peruvian society. So we know that C is not going to be correct either. Let's check D. Some of the peoples and places Chambi photographed had long been popular subjects for Peruvian photographers. D calls for multiple Peruvian photographers other than Chambi, right? But that's not mentioned anywhere here. And of course, once again, this doesn't argue anything about ethnographic value and Peruvian society, because it says some of the peoples had long been popular subjects. It doesn't represent society, it represents a few select people. So as a result of that, A would be our correct answer, because it directly addresses the claim being made by the student and supports that claim. Let's try one last example. When digging for clams, their primary food, sea otters damage the roots of eelgrass plants growing on the seafloor. Near Vancouver Island in Canada, the otter population is large and well established, yet the eelgrass meadows are healthier than those found elsewhere off Canada's coast. To explain this, conservation scientists Aaron Foster and colleagues compared the Vancouver Island meadows to meadows where otters were absent or were reintroduced only recently. Finding that Vancouver Island meadows have a more diverse gene pool than others do, Foster hypothesized that damage to eelgrass roots increases the plant's rate of sexual reproduction. This, in turn, boosts genetic diversity, which benefits the meadow's health overall. Let's look at some of the answer choices. Which finding, if true, would most directly undermine Foster's hypothesis? So we're looking for what would refute the hypothesis that as otters damage the roots of eelgrass plants, it would increase the rate of sexual production. Okay, so let's look at some of our answer choices. Let's look at A. At some sites in the study, eelgrass meadows are found near otter populations that are small and have only recently been reintroduced. This question is very tricky. It is worded in a way that makes it seem like a really good answer, because you might think that the eelgrass meadows are present where otters have only recently been introduced, okay? And in here they're comparing otter populations that have established versus otter populations that were reintroduced only recently, and they're hypothesizing that the ones that have been there longer will have healthier meadows. So the presence of eelgrass meadows where otter populations are small might seem like it would refute the hypothesis. However, this is not related to the hypothesis because it says eelgrass meadows are found near otter populations. It doesn't have anything to do with the meadow's health. This hypothesis is talking about the meadow's health overall. The presence of a meadow doesn't have anything to do with the health. It just means that the meadow is there, but it doesn't talk about the health. So we can actually eliminate A. Let's look at B. At several sites not included in the study, there are large, well-established sea otter populations, but no eelgrass meadows. B is definitely not correct, because here there are no eelgrass meadows. How can you check the health of an eelgrass meadow if there is none at all? So B is not correct. C. At several sites not included in the study, eelgrass meadows' health correlates negatively with the length of residence and size of otter populations. So let's look at this. A negative correlation means that as one variable increases, the other decreases. So that would mean that the length of residence of the otters, as that increases, the health of the meadows would decrease. So this is arguing that, well, there are places that you didn't include in your study where the longer the otters were there, the more unhealthy the eelgrass was. And this is a direct rebuttal, and it addresses the hypothesis directly, and it undermines the hypothesis. So C here would actually be the correct answer, but let's also check D. D. At some sites in the study, the health of plants unrelated to eelgrass correlates negatively with the length of residence and size of otter populations. Now this one is definitely incorrect as well, because they're talking about plants unrelated to eelgrass, but the hypothesis is talking about eelgrass. So plants unrelated to eelgrass would have nothing to do with the hypothesis. So let's move on to some tips before we wrap up the lesson. Just remember to first read the prompt carefully, understand what they're trying to say, the point they're trying to get across. 2 is to determine the main points and understand the prompt. Try to get a grasp of what they're trying to imply, the claim that they're trying to make, because you need to understand the claim so that you can 3, analyze the questions. Analyze the questions, analyze the main question they're asking you, and analyze the answer choices. You need to be able to understand the claim that they're making in the prompt in order to pick an answer choice that directly relates to this or addresses this. And 4, verify. Does this make sense? Once you think you've chosen your answer, make sure you check the claim and you check your answer. And if they relate and they are correct, then you know that your answer will be correct. So hopefully these tips help you. Thank you for your time, and make sure that you should always read the questions carefully. That way you know which one is correct. My name is Joseph Misak. Please stay tuned for more lessons in the future, and please subscribe. It helps me a lot to make these free lessons. Thank you for your time, and good luck on any testing you have later in the future.